Chat Me2 looks at lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans lives in Brighton and Hove. We're seeking to progress social change by working with local community groups and services who want to improve lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans lives in the city. Spectrum approached the University of Brighton through the Community University Partnership Project and asked for some research to be done on lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans need in the city. They thought that whilst Brighton is presented as this gay capital, as this really safe and tolerant place, that there were still areas of need that needed to be addressed, and that whilst legislation and equalities agendas had progressed some people's lives, not everybody was being carried along in those changes.
We thought that there were groups in the population that were being missed by services, lots of people who were isolated. So the typical kind of politicians' thinking was about double income, no kids, gay men with jobs in the city who were doing okay and belonged to the Labour Party and had lots of poodles and went to Pride. The reality from my perspective of the people I were meeting is there were lots of people who had very poor social networks, had experienced lots of hate crime and exclusion along the journey that they had.
There continues to be multiple areas of need for more marginalised sectors of the lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans community, and particularly bisexual and trans people were seen to be both excluded from the broader LGBT community and from mainstream society as well.
There were about 50 groups and organisations that you could say make up the community in a formal sense. But there are whole swathes of vulnerable people where there aren't groups. So there isn't a group for older lesbians, there isn't a group for disabled LGBT people. We asked the steering group from the community, which were mostly community activists that were known to us, who is it we think is marginalised in the community, and came up with about 30 different groups of people, not organisations, but groups of types of people who we thought we didn't know very much about. And we managed to finally hold 20 focus groups.
We made sure that services and people who were going to affect the change were included from the outset. So rather than starting from a model where the community works with the university and then the community tells service providers what to do, we worked with people all sitting around the table right from the start.
This was an opportunity to test the waters in terms of where was the community at, who was not getting what they needed, and what together could we do to resolve this. And by together I meant individuals in the community, various groups, services, mainstream voluntary sector services, and importantly those who commission services and fund them. Because I think we'll have to look into the context, and it's still true that very few services actually monitor who gets what in terms of their sexuality or gender identity. So whole swathes of services just don't know who's using their services, let alone what experience they have. And that's something I think that still remains to be done in relation to the Equality Act.
When we've published all these, we realised that they were really academic, and they are over 500,000 words of findings, and people weren't reading them. Particularly local community people weren't reading them. So we then published 2-page summaries of each of the findings for the local community groups. We then went on to write posters for each of the findings, and then we had a number of exhibitions, including in the University of Brighton, in the Jubilee Library, and in the British Museum. And we're just going to go to one of the key events on the LGBT calendar in order to kind of publicise some of these findings. And the idea behind that was that these findings wouldn't remain on a dusty shelf, but would actually start to educate people about LGBT lives in the city, but also educate LGBT people themselves about how they might exclude each other. So it was a kind of multi-pronged approach to thinking about how we might use the findings to progress social change.
This evidence gives us some stories, some suggestions about where to go, but we actually need to ask our service users, and we need to find out if LGBT people aren't using our services or aren't having a positive experience of our service, what do we need to do? The question that the research poses has gone in all sorts of directions, and will take some time to take account of also what's happened.
Well, the findings are already part of policy within the city. So, for example, the housing policy in the city now includes an LGBT element, and that was written in part from the findings of Count Me In 2. Domestic violence and abuse now has a domestic violence worker that particularly deals with gay, bisexual and trans men who were pointed in the research as being particularly vulnerable, and that was again leading from the findings of the research. Increasingly the research is being picked up on a national level, and so we've had contact with the Government Equalities unit who are interested in using the research and particularly the way the research was undertaken to develop their own agendas, and particularly around the new Equalities Act which just came in April.
I think what the research has done is given a very strong and comprehensive and inclusive evidence base. Certain quick wins have happened, so certain posts have been created. So for example, there are 2 LGBT substance misuse workers that have come into post. There's work around deaf LGBT people in relation to HIV prevention, etc., etc. Some quick wins of, yes, there's some urgent work that needs to happen that's got an LGBT specific focus, and I think the big thing is that there's a lot more change needs to happen.
The research is being used as part of policy, but we're also being told in other areas that Count Me In 2 is being picked up to allow people to argue for services, to allow people to argue for provision for LGBT people, and that's been really important.
People from members of the community needing services to commissioners who decide what services there are need to stay in a conversation. It's not just about a kind of snapshot in time of people's needs. It's about, if we're going to resolve some of these issues, we need to carry on a conversation. So I think for me the real lesson is keep talking and keep trying to reach further, and most importantly to those that feel most excluded.